how you word it. So the answer is like this, that with Yaakov Avinu, and the same would apply to all tzaddikim, that we say, and we apply this principle, is that even though from our perception, the way we see it, Yaakov is no longer here, and that's the way it is according to Torah, and that's why there was a burial. What we're saying is that this is the way it's perceived in our world, in the natural world. But in reality, Hashem is telling us in the Torah that Yaakov's presence is still here. And not only still here, the way a neshama continues to exist, but it's still here connected to the physical body and to the physical world. That's what it means. In that way, it's unique. And in that way, it's still here. And if not for the fact that Yaakov was still continuing, his presence still continues to be connected to his physical body and this physical world, then we wouldn't have been able to continue as Jews and thrive as Jews in spite of all the challenges that we went through over these thousands of years. In fact, Yaakov is the one who is giving us the strength, but that's because he's not removed from us. He's not somewhere in a spiritual world far, far away from us, but of course his presence is here in a way that he's connected to the physical world and has an impact on the physical world. To give an example, there was once a Farbrengen, and I mentioned yesterday that the Rebbe spoke this way about the previous Rebbe. And there's a book called Proceeding Together, which are the sichos that the Rebbe gave that first year after the Histalkus, after the passing of the Frierdiker Rebbe. And in that book, in that collection of sichos, you find it again and again and again how the Rebbe talks about this idea that the Rebbe is here, the Rebbe is alive, the Rebbe is with us. At one occasion, the Rebbe made the following comment. He said, if the Rebbe is here, then how am I sitting and talking here? How could we be doing what we're doing in the presence of the Rebbe? And the answer was that those halachas that apply, that you're not allowed to do certain things in front of your Rebbe, or you're not allowed to, in this case, speak in front of his presence unless he gives you permission. The Rebbe says these halachas apply only when you can see him with your physical eyes. So in other words, we don't see with our physical eyes, but the reality is, and Torah is the one that defines reality. That's another main point. How do we define reality? For any secular person, reality is defined by the experts, scientists, doctors, people who study nature. They can define the reality for us, and we can define the reality ourselves with our eyes, what we see, what we feel. But for a Yid, Torah defines reality. So the Torah says that Yaakov is alive. That's the definition. That's the reality to us. And let me add one more thing that explains that a little bit better. What is the definition of life? How do you define life? According to science, life means when there is activity. The person who's alive is a person who is active. And if God forbid is not well, but still internally his organs are active, there's heart activity, there's brain activity. If chas v'sholem, all this activity stops, then the person's considered not alive. If there's absolutely no activity, not externally and not internally, that's the definition of the opposite of life. Because science does not recognize the neshama, so everything's defined biologically by the physical body. That's it. According to Torah, the definition of life and a person that's alive is if the neshama is in the body. That's the definition of life. If the neshama is connected to the body, they are considered alive. If the neshama is disconnected from the body, God forbid, they're not alive. All the things that science talks about and medicine talks about is a symptom that will allow us to know whether the neshama is in the body or not. So if chas v'shalom, all activity stops, and there's no activity in the, not brain activity, not heart activity, there's nothing going on, and according to the Torah, this person is considered not alive, but the reason for that is because these are indications that the neshama is no longer in the body. But that's not the definition. Again, in science, the definition of life is that there's activity. The definition of the opposite of life is that there is no activity. So in science, it's impossible. It's a contradiction of terms to say the person is buried, there's no activity, and they're alive. It's a contradiction of terms. But according to Torah, if the definition of life is that the neshama is connected to the body, and the neshama is influencing the world through the body, and is having an impact on the world through its connection to the body, then the Torah is testifying that Yaakov was buried. Outwardly, we saw no activity, but in this case, the Torah says, don't take that as an indication that his neshama is no longer connected to his body. The neshama is connected to the body, and his neshama is present here in this world, even though we can't see, and so on and so forth. So therefore, there was a burial because on a certain external level, we don't see, and Yaakov is hidden from us. And on an external level, there's no normal activity as we see it in an ordinary human being of flesh and blood. But the Torah testifies that Yaakov's presence is here, and he continues to be here all this time. If we would think of an example, every Friday night, we come home from shul, and we say Shalom Aleichem. What are we doing? Who are we talking to? Talking to angels. You don't see them, you don't feel them, you don't hear them. And you're talking to them, you say, Shalom Aleichem, welcome into my home. And then you say, B'acham l'shalom, come in. And then you say, Barchuni l'shalom, please give me a blessing. And then when they leave, we escort them, we say, Tzeischem l'shalom. So we have this whole song. We sing it every Friday night, all Jews all over the world. We're talking directly to the malachim, but we don't see, we don't hear, we don't feel. But because the Torah tells us that they're there, we're absolutely certain that the malachim's presence are in the room, and we're speaking to them, and they hear us, and they're responding to us. So the same thing is with Yaakov Lomes. That what we're saying is that the Rebbe's presence is here, and he's here in a way that he is connected to the physical world, because there are, of course, neshamas that after leaving this world, they go to Gan Eden, they go into a higher spiritual place. But the truth is that the further away they are and the higher they are, they're less connected to this physical world. And that means they don't really perceive things the way we perceive them, and they don't relate to things the way we relate to them. But a tzaddik who's here in this physical world, physically alive, he's a human being. He sees, he hears, he feels, he understands our pain and perceives things the way we perceive them and gives us the brachas that we need as humans. And that is something which a tzaddik like Yaakov Avinu or other tzaddikim that this applies to, means that it continues, that they still continue in that particular way. One of the ramifications, the question was, practically speaking, what's the difference? One of the ramifications are that the Rebbe gave certain heroes, certain directives, what we should do, how we should do, when we should do certain things. And sometimes we're talking about general directives that the Rebbe gave to every single chassid. And sometimes there are personal people who wrote to the Rebbe, people who had the merit to be in yechidus, they had a personal audience with the Rebbe, And he spoke to them and he told them they should go somewhere on shlichus. He told them that they should do something in the community that they live, told them about something they should do with their family, one of their children, whatever it may be. The feeling is, after the passing of the tzaddik, the person doesn't feel any longer so compelled to do those things because now it's different. Especially somebody that's not on that greatest level. He feels, well, before the Rebbe might send me a letter or might even call me in and say, how come you didn't listen to what I told you to do? Now they don't have that feeling, that fear. When a person feels and recognizes that the Rebbe's presence is here no different, no less than before, then in reality, his presence is connected to us and he's observing what we do and how we do, and all his wishes and all his directives continue just like before, then the person's devotion and dedication to the Rebbe's words and the Rebbe's will and the Rebbe's wish continue no less than before. In fact, what I just finished telling you is something which the Rebbe spoke about. And he said that after the passing of the Frierdiker Rebbe, there were certain people that wanted to change from what they were told to do. The Rebbe gave an example of someone who was on shlichus, and he wanted to leave his place of shlichus after the previous Rebbe's passing. Well, the Rebbe gave an example of someone who had sent his child to one of the yeshivas of the Rebbe, was under the auspices of the Rebbe, and after the passing of the Frierdiker Rebbe, he decided to pull his child out and to send him to another yeshiva. Why now? Because his feeling was, okay, now that the Rebbe is no longer here, I'm a little bit more free to do things the way I want to do it. And of course, the Rebbe said that how this is wrong, and the Rebbe is here, and therefore everything he told you as an individual, or everything he told us as Hasidim in general, this is something that we need to continue. There's nothing that changed. In fact, the Rebbe himself is the biggest example of this. If you look at all the Rebbe's miftzayim, it's all things the Rebbe always spoke about, everything that he came out with and said that the previous Rebbe spoke about this, previous Rebbe spoke about that. And therefore the Rebbe took it and he continued with it. And not only continued with it, he took all those things and he made it extremely much greater and bigger and spread out more globally than ever before. Like just like the concept of shlichus. It really began in the times of the previous Rebbe, but no way on the scale that it became in our generation. So the Rebbe took this idea of shlichus, and after the passing of the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Rebbe actually expanded it hundreds of times more. And the same was with many other things. So this is something which is really practical, that the understanding that the Rebbe's presence is here, the Rebbe's presence is with us in a way that, again, he's connected to the physical world, has an impact on the physical world, understands our physical needs and our physical pains, and therefore the things that he tells us to do, these are all things that we must continue to fulfill because there is no difference. Everything continues as before. There's a story. It's actually written probably one of the oldest, or maybe the oldest book of stories of the Baal Shem Tov. It was written by one of the students, and it's considered to be a authentic book, where it tells a story that someone once asked Reb Nachum of Chernobyl, who was very close to the son of the Mezritcher Maggid. The son of the Mezritcher Maggid, his name was Rabbi Avram. They used to call him the Malach, the angel, because he lived such a spiritual life, hardly ate and hardly slept, that they called him the Malach. This Rabbi Avram was, of course, the son of Maggid. He was a very big tzaddik. And Reb Nachum Chernobyl was one of his friends and colleagues. And one time I asked him, do you ever see your father? And he said, yes. This is after the passing of the Mezritcher Maggid. And he said to him, you see him in a dream or you actually see him physically, you see him in this world? And he said, both. Sometimes I see him in a dream, and sometimes I can see him in actuality, just like I saw him during his lifetime. And he told him a story that after the passing of his father, there was a certain member of the community who was very wealthy. And unfortunately, sometimes people who have a lot of wealth are also arrogant, want to control everything. And this wealthy person was giving the Maggid's son, Rebbe Ram the Malach, a very hard time. It was harassing him. And he went to his father. When he saw his father, the Maggid, who again was no longer here physically, he told him that he's having a lot of suffering because of this person. And the Maggid said, I'll take care of it. Go tell the Gabbai, the person who used to be the secretary of the Maggid, tell him to call that person to come to me. What does come to me mean? You should go to your shul where you are. Of course, when the Gabbai heard this message, it was quite frightening. He went to this rich man, took a while till he found him, and he told him that the Rebbe, meaning the Maggid Mezrich, wants to see you. And he looked at him and said, what are you talking about? The Maggid Mezrich passed away. And he said, but I'm telling you, he wants to see you, and don't play a game with this. You have to show up, and I'll tell you where to go. So he was curious to understand what was going on. He came into the shul, and he was shocked to see the Mezrich Maggid was sitting there by the table, just like during his lifetime. And the Mezrich Maggid said to him, why are you harassing my son? Why are you giving him such a hard time? And he began to excuse himself and defend himself and say, because of this, because of that. And the Maggid stopped him and said, don't give me any excuses. I just want you to stop doing this. You think that I'm not here, and therefore you can do whatever you wish to do. So I wanted to let you know that I am here, and you should stop doing all those things, these negative things, and I don't want to ever have to hear about this again. And he left. He didn't just go home, he ran home. He was in a state of panic. And when he walked into his house, he fainted. Naturally, the family ran, they revived him. When he got back to himself, they asked him what happened. Why you don't feel well? What happened? And he told them the story about the Maggid Mezrich. So they said, then you must quickly go to his son, Rebbe Avram the Malach, and ask him for forgiveness. So they all got together, and they went to the house of Rebbe Avram the Malach. When they came to his house, he smiled and he said, oh, my father spoke to you? And they asked him, how do you know? And he said, oh, he told me he's going to be speaking to you. This kind of communication with his father, as if his father was alive, is because it's not as if, because he was able to communicate with his father. Just like we said in the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi came to his family and he sat by the table and he was there every Friday night. That's the way it is with tzaddikim. We find stories like this with the Baal Shem Tov, and find stories like this with the Alter Rebbe and the Mittel Rebbe, Tzemach Tzedek, that they actually sometimes revealed how they saw their grandfather or their father, and they spoke with them, and they told them certain things, and so on. One of the interesting customs that the Rebbe had, which also shows you what I mentioned before, how the Rebbe reiterated over and over and over about his father-in-law, that the Rebbe is here. The previous Rebbe would get a certain aliyah, was called up to the Torah, on Simchas Torah. And after the passing, the Rebbe was honored with getting that aliyah. And the Rebbe said that I'm not going to go up to the Torah unless you call up my father-in-law as well. And every Simchas Torah, they would actually call to the Torah, and they would say the Rebbe's name, and call up the previous Rebbe to the Torah as well. Another thing, when you listen to the Rebbe's tapes of Sichos, the Rebbe mentions the previous Rebbe all the time. So he mentioned him tens of thousands of times. There's not a Farbrengen that goes by where the Rebbe doesn't mention something from his father-in-law. And he always says, the Rebbe, my father-in-law. The interesting thing is that when you mention a tzaddik, you're always supposed to add the word Zecher Tzaddik Levracha, which means the tzaddik's memory should be for blessing, or similar terms. You will not find, not even once in all the 42 years that the Rebbe spoke after the passing of the previous Rebbe, not even one time where the Rebbe should mention the previous Rebbe's name and say his neshama is in Gan Eden, or to say Zecher Tzaddik Levracha. And in the first year of the Farbrengen, the Rebbe explained why he doesn't do that. And his answer was, because to me, the Rebbe is here. And just like you're not going to speak about memory for someone who is alive, I'm not going to speak about a memory about my father-in-law. So this is the kind of language that the Rebbe spoke, and this is the way the Rebbe related to it, and that's the way we relate to the Rebbe as well, that the Rebbe's presence continues to be with us, and not in some sort of a way that he's in the high heavens, but that his presence continues to be with us in a way that is connected to the physical body, to the physical world. And this is the reason why, when it comes to davening, and the Rebbe's minyan, the Rebbe's place is set up. I'll explain where that comes from. After the previous Rebbe was nostalgic, that was Yud Shvat. 2 months later was Pesach. Now the Rebbe would eat by the previous Rebbe's table on Pesach. So that year the Rebbe also ate by the previous Rebbe's table. And by the previous Rebbe's table, it wasn't only the Rebbe and the Rebbe's brother-in-law, but there were usually about 10 older Hasidim that also were by the table. And the same was that year as well. And then the Rebbe made the following comment. The Rebbe said, it was puzzling for me. Last year, when the doors were closed, meaning to say they didn't allow everyone to come in because they felt that this would be a risk for the previous Rebbe's health. A lot of people crowd into the rooms, not enough air. So they limited the amount of people that can come in. And people would push and beg and plead, let me in. So in previous years, where there were restrictions, people made every effort to try to get in. This year, there were no restrictions, obviously, and people didn't show up. Well, what's so puzzling about that? Last year, the previous Rebbe was sitting by the table, so everyone came to be by the table where the previous Rebbe was. But this year, after the passing, why would they come? And the Rebbe gave 2 reasons why they came, why they should have come. One reason was the mere fact that this is the room where the previous Rebbe for 10 years, here's where he performed the Seder, and all the spiritual things related to the Seder took place in this room. So that's enough of a reason why every chassid should want to be there during that time of the Seder. The second thing is, the Gemara says that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi came back to his family every Friday night. And that's why he actually requested the chair should remain in its place. The table should remain in its place. The bed should remain in its place, because he's coming back to the same place. So therefore, the Rebbe said, I would have expected that the Hasidim should be here, because certainly, just like Rabbi Yehuda Nasi came Friday night to the Friday night table, certainly my father-in-law came to the Seder table where we always ate the Seder. So therefore, when we say that the Rebbe's presence is here, specifically in those times that he was always spent together with Hasidim, there's a feeling that this is a time where the Rebbe's presence is here, and we want to be there as well. I want to go over to number 12 now, which is that the Frierdiker Rebbe was considered alive. Why was there a need for a new Rebbe? And number 13, why don't we have a new Rebbe now? Also a common question that people ask. And the answer is, like we explained before, that even though Yaakov Lomes, nevertheless, there was a burial. He was buried, and it's not a figment of our imagination, it's reality. And the reason for that is because externally and outwardly, and the way the world, the natural world, perceives things, we don't see him anymore, and he's not here anymore. But in reality, the Torah testifies that his presence is here. So being that the presence is here, but in a way that it's lacking externally, so therefore there was a need for a new Rebbe. In fact, the Rebbe said this many times, that every generation, the Rebbes of Chabad, that's how we define the generations. The Alter Rebbe was the first generation, the Mittel Rebbe was the second generation, the previous Rebbe was the sixth generation. And the Rebbe always, whenever he talks about this subject, he says the sixth generation was completed on Yud Shvat 1950, the day of the passing of the previous Rebbe. And after that is the beginning of the new generation, the seventh generation. So that means that even though we say that the Rebbe is here and that his presence is here and it's here in a way that's connected to the physical world, but obviously not in an absolute complete way, to the extent that we can say that his generation was completed and there's a need for a new Rebbe because there's a new generation. And that's why the Rebbe became the seventh Rebbe. In our case, the Rebbe reiterated many, many times, in a sense, preparing us for this time, and told us over and over and over that the seventh generation, this is the generation where Mashiach will come. And this is the generation that will continue until Mashiach comes. There is no new generation, which means there is no new leadership, but the Rebbe's leadership continues even after Gimmel Tammuz, in a way just like before. And in fact, when people ask, so what's the reason why we don't appoint a new Rebbe? The real reason is because there was actually a talk that the Rebbe gave. One time, the Rebbe spoke publicly about what if something like this will happen. It was the second day of Adar, in the year Tufshin Memches, 1988. It was at the end of the Shiva, of the passing of the Rebbetzin. And in that Sikha, the Rebbe spoke about what if this will happen? What if there'll be a Gimmel Tammuz? Of course, the Rebbe didn't call it Gimmel Tammuz. He used other words, but it was about what if something like this will happen? And the Rebbe said, then all the questions people have, who will they address? Who will they ask? And the Rebbe said that they should ask the Rabbanim, the Hasidische Bezdin of their community. That's who they should turn to. He said it over and over again. There should be no mistake, no misunderstanding. In addition to always going to a doctor for medical advice and going to an expert in finances for business advice and going to a mashpia for spiritual advice, if a person comes up with a question and they don't know who they're going to ask this question now, the answer is they should go to the Bezdin, the Hasidic Bezdin of their community, and present the question to them, which means the Rebbe made it clear that he's saying there should not be anybody appointed in his place. And therefore, this is consistent with what the Rebbe said, that the seventh generation, this is the final generation, and this is the generation that will witness the Geula through Mashiach. So therefore, the Rebbe's leadership continues in a way even more than by the previous Rebbe, based on the Rebbe's own words. That the seventh generation has not ended until we see Mashiach, Beis Hamikdash, actual, factual, going out of Golus. It's still all part of the seventh generation, which means all part of the Rebbe's leadership. Which means that the Rebbe's presence in the physical world with us and involved with us and giving us his brachas, all this continues in a way which is even more than the way it continued by the previous Rebbe. And then there's one more thing that I would like to talk about is when you when Gimmel Tammuz will be here. Hopefully by that time Mashiach will be here and there won't be any need to explain anything. But those who remember from Gimmel Tammuz last year, 2 years ago, saw there was a lot of singing and dancing, bringing, and to many people it's a little bit shocking. Like, how does that fit in? We couldn't be any more devastated than this, the fact that we don't have any more bringings, any seekers, we don't see the Rebbe physically, the Rebbe is not here with us. So how could there be simcha such a time? What does it mean? And the answer is there's another thing, another challenge that Gimmel Tammuz represents. And that is that the Rebbe promised us throughout the years, and specifically in the recent years, starting in the 1990s, that this is the time that the coming of Mashiach is imminent. And not only that it's going to happen, but it's already happening. And the Rebbe pointed to many things that are taking place in the world, globally, things that are happening with Israel, things that are happening in Russia, things that are happening in the Jewish community, things that are happening in the non-Jewish community. Spoke about this many times throughout the year. There's so many things that are happening. It's all part of the process of Geula unfolding in front of our eyes. Like the famous talk the Rebbe gave about the Kitzu Chabesam Li'itim, that the nations of the world made a pact to reduce arms and not to allow production of nuclear weapons and using nuclear weapons. In fact, the ultimate goal is there should be no wars, and that all situations to resolve things just through peaceful negotiations. And the Rebbe said this is not just a beautiful, wonderful political change. This is fulfillment. We're observing with our eyes. We have the merit to see the fulfillment of the promise that when Mashiach comes, there will no longer be wars. All the nations will put down their swords. It's not complete, but we're seeing how this is unfolding in front of our eyes. And the same is with many other things. And in the Rebbe's talks, the Rebbe clearly said this is happening in our generation and that we're going out of Golus and it's coming very soon. And when Gimmel Tammuz happened, to many people this was a shock. It sort of didn't fit in to the scheme of things. And to some people, the feeling was, I guess, we blew it. We had an opportunity, we had a chance, and we sort of missed the boat. And that's why this is what happened. But whoever studies the Sichos of the Rebbe properly and remembers what the Rebbe said, it's clear in the Rebbe Sichos that this is not something that we could miss the boat. Yes, in previous generations, there were such situations. There were opportunities for Mashiach to come, and there were times that had great potential, and we missed the opportunity. But the Rebbe said, now we're beyond that. Now we're at a point where everything was already done, and it's certainly and definitely, these are the kind of words the Rebbe used, without a doubt, without even a shadow of a doubt, without a doubt of a doubt, this is the time that Mashiach is coming. And it's coming in a physical sense, going out of Golus, being in Yerushalayim, building the Beis HaMikdash, and then all of a sudden, something like Gimmel Tammuz takes place. So the only way we can explain it is the way the Rebbe explains it. When the passing of the Rebbetzin took place a few years earlier, the Rebbe said, how does that fit in? We're talking about Mashiach and the imminence of Mashiach. And the only explanation is that this is Yerida Tzerech Aliyah, that this is something which happened, which is a descent, but the ultimate purpose of every descent is for an ascent, to go up. Everything that goes down, the ultimate purpose is that eventually it'll go up even higher and greater than before. So therefore, when we see the stalkers, the passing of the Rebbetzin, there's no doubt that this is in preparation for what's going to come, which is Mashiach, and Tchias HaMesim, all those that passed away will come back in life, and we'll see them physically and be reunited once again. So therefore, the simcha that you see, people dancing and singing or people being happy, that is coming from the fact that the Rebbe tells us to have the absolute bitachon, absolute trust. and absolute confidence that the words of the Rebbe are true and they stand forever, that certainly we're living in the times of Mashiach. And the mere fact that we show Hashem that we have that trust and we have that confidence and we believe in the Rebbe's words, that in itself is instrumental that this should be fulfilled much sooner. So in other words, Dafka Nadei La Gimmel Tammuz, which presents a challenge to this belief. And like I said, to many people, it sort of shook their belief. It weakened their belief because of what happened. So we have to do the opposite, be strong, and be strong in our emunah. And the way we can show openly that we're strong in our emunah and bitachon that Mashiach is coming, and once again we'll be able to see the Rebbe with our physical eyes, and he'll lead us out of galus. That is expressed through simcha, through our simcha, and therefore that's the explanation where the simcha comes from. On that day of Gimmel Tammuz, there probably will be also a lot of booklets or notices or announcements, so you'll see what people are doing. But in general, that's a day that we ask the Rebbe for brachas. It's a day to make farbrengens. It's a day to add in tzedakah. It's a day where every chassid writes a pan to the Rebbe. In other words, this is a day that we have to actually reinforce our connection to the Rebbe, our skashus to the Rebbe. And that's reinforced by writing to him and asking for bracha for ourselves and our families. And therefore, regarding the question some people bring up, so if you're saying the Rebbe is here and the Rebbe's presence is with us, is there any point to going to the Ohel? And the answer is, of course, we just finished saying that Yaakov Avinu, Lemes, Yaakov is alive, and he continues to live, and he's alive here in the physical sense. And nevertheless, of course, it's a different kind of living, a different kind of life, not what we're familiar with, obviously. But nevertheless, is what we need to know. We can't understand. If someone will ask me, so explain me, Rabbi Majeski, how exactly is it? How is he living? What is he doing? There's no way anyone could make any attempt to explain that because it's beyond us. What we could explain is what it's not. The Rebbe is not disconnected from us. He's not distant from us. He continues to be with us, and his presence continues with us, and his brachas and his prayers continue to be for us and to help us and guide us. And we see so many tens of hundreds of stories. This is what we do know. And therefore, on this day, we strengthen our kashus to the Rebbe. And it's a time to strengthen our emunah and bitachon and confidence that this is just one big test and the last test. And very soon, sooner than soon, we'll see the Gula Mitzvah Shlema, and we'll be able to see the Rebbe physically, and he'll be there at the head leading us out of Golus. And everything we spoke about is all related to Golus. And Emir Hashem, when we go out of Golus, we'll have more things to talk about. So stay tuned. Okay. I'd like to wish everybody a hope to see you tonight, Emir Hashem, in person.
Thank you.
At the dorm in Yerushalayim.
Amen. Thank you.
Amen.
Okay, bye-bye.